We are ready to go, and I'll like to welcome what I understand is up to 500 people on this second webinar organised by the APLF fair organisation, who run the upcoming Hong Kong fair, and others, and Leather International magazine, along with their new sponsor, the Lectra. This is the second seminar. The first one was run about a month ago, and by Ron Sasoya, and it's a precursor for some discussions that are going to take place on the Monday evening in Hong Kong, which is an invite-only event, but I understand that the organisers are asking those who are interested to come along and be involved, to indicate that they have an interest, and they'll be in contact if appropriate. When Ron Sawyer did his webinar a month ago, he neatly avoided defining luxury, quite wisely in many ways, because it's a difficult topic, and the way he wanted to frame what he was talking about, it was sensible to stay clear of luxury altogether. But this morning I want to go deeply into the subject. I want to talk for about half an hour, and then I'm advised that I'll be asked questions which will come up here for me to look at, and I will try and respond to you. I should probably introduce myself, because I know, as well as 400 or 500 people watching in from different parts of the world, to whom we say good morning if you're in Europe, good evening if you're in Asia, and why aren't you in bed if you're in the United States. But my name is Mike Redwood. I'm the spokesperson for the Leather Naturally program, which is a supporter of these seminars. I have been asked what members get out of Leather Naturally by being members. It's a promotional program and an educational program for leather, defending leather against the some of the worst attacks that come from various anti-leather bodies around the world, and promoting it to designers. And I'm very glad to say that here in the room in front of me, we're in Northampton University, where my other leather hat is, as I'm a visiting professor here. This is our careers day for leather. So we have a room here of about 50 people, which includes our students, some from fashion and mostly from leather, and a lot of industry representatives from major chemical companies like Stahl and Lanxess, TFL, Smith & Zoom, and others. And I'm very pleased to say, I think that they are all members of Leather Naturally. And they'll know is that the reward you get for being part of Leather Naturally is the fact that if we can keep this moving, we really can push the defence and the promotion of leather. And I think as I talk on, you'll see just how important that is as a concept and as an action point for our industry. Leather's been made here in Northampton for well over 1,000 years. Leather education's been here for well over 100 years, and since the closure of educational institutes in London and in Leeds, it's become the main centre and the sole centre for leather education in the UK, and the biggest certainly in Europe, and probably the most important in the world. So it's great to be here at such a significant time in the industry's development. And interesting enough, last night I was taken to a soccer match and the local team here, in recognition of the fact that this is a great footwear and leather city. The local team's called the Cobblers, and they had an excellent, well-deserved victory. And curiously, which I think many of our American colleagues watching will recognise where a lot of sports teams are named after meatpacking companies. Just a few hours down the road from here, where I live in Somerset, where I support the Yeovil Town team, they are called the Glovers. So it just shows you how both history and current activities insinuate themselves through our lives. And leather is truly important. If you're thinking about luxury, the origin of luxury comes from the Latin to mean excess. And the simplest definition that we hear about in relation to luxury is anything which is not a necessity. Now that's an interesting point if you're thinking about leather over the ages, because at the beginning of civilization and the establishment of villages and cities and trade, leather, when you think back, was a necessity. We required leather for clothing, for footwear, for riding horses, for ropes, we didn't have textiles. It was the essential material that allowed us to live and to survive, develop and prosper. And even if you have the opportunity to make a trip to a beautiful country like Tibet and drive down from the airport into the capital Lhasa, you will see that they still use leather coracles, leather boats. And you begin to see how useful the material is. It's light, you can carry it over the rapids, it doesn't damage if it gets caught on the rocks. It's better in those circumstances than wood, and it's essential if you don't have really thick trees out of which you can dig canoes. And in places like Tibet, it is still the only access that they've got into certain mountain villages. And you begin to recognize the absolute value that leather has had over the ages in allowing our civilization to advance. But of course, as we moved through the next 2-3 millennium, alternative materials like textiles and glass and other materials were found, making leather less essential in many end uses and replacing it with better materials. And at the same time, we had certain groups in society where types of leather, types of raw material, certain colours got separated out, and they got used exclusively by the royalty, by the clergy, or by very rich people. And they tended to be items that were exquisitely made. They were exclusive to those groups. They were hard to get hold of, and they were very expensive. So we began to see the evolution of luxury in leather as well as necessity in certain categories. But the number of categories where leather was necessary was declining steadily. And then as we moved through the Industrial Revolution, we got another big change coming up, which was the development of the middle classes. And you saw that in the middle of the 19th century, particularly the United States, which urbanized very, very quickly. We had rapid growth of the middle classes. The middle classes couldn't afford luxuries, but they did look a little bit for quality. And we got a category of items that came forward of things that were very well made, things that lasted, things that could be repaired, and quite often things that were adjusted to perfectly fit within the house. So quite often, well into the 20th century, it was common for a lady to buy her clothes in the shop. They would be well made, but she would adjust them at home on her own sewing machine with her own skills to make them perfectly fit and to be personalized. And that's a really interesting area to remember, that quality of goods that certain groups in our society, as they began to have disposable income, looked for, but they were not what we would call luxury. And things began to change. Things began to change in the late 1980s. That's a really interesting period for those who remember it. That's the time when we got excited about branding. It evidenced itself in a couple of points. Which was, first of all, companies like Rowntree's got bought by Nestle for 6 or 7 times the enterprise value by normal calculations. That's to say, they paid a huge amount just for the brand value, because if you eat Kit Kats, the Kit Kat goes on forever, has got a pretty strong and guaranteed cash flow, and it's worth paying for, over above the buildings, the stock, the cars, the money in the bank that the company owns. And we began to put a different type of value on brands than we'd ever had before. At the same time, we got a real enthusiasm. Marketing got involved in a serious way, and we had lots of people that wanted to buy Rolexes and Porsches and products like that. And you even got to a situation where products like the Timberland Classic Boot, I think they call it the 30003 lug now, you know, that nice blood brown colour with the Vibram sole. You could get mugged in Rome in the late 1980s for someone to steal your Timberland boots. We became quite fanatic about brands at that time. And a company called Louis Vuitton, who you may have heard of, got really going at that period. They'd been securing their position by buying up total control of their outlets as well as their manufacturing. That meant that how their brand was seen by consumers was totally under their control, as was the big markups that come at retail on products, as well as through manufacturing their own products was the quality control. And Louis Vuitton began buying up other companies, so they had a portfolio of brands, and they began making them more accessible by putting groups of stores into airports and into cities where they hadn't been before. And we suddenly began to see that luxury wasn't as difficult to get hold of, certainly if you had money, as it had been in the past. And we began to see more and more things being defined as luxury if there was strong branding behind the brand name. So nowadays we tend to think of Coach as a luxury brand. And then you go away and think, well, if you bought a Coach bag in the 1980s, you were buying quality, but you weren't buying luxury as a consumer. And can a product be luxury if everyone owns one? So Coach turnover £4 billion a year. Is it right to call them $4 billion a year and very widely distributed? Is it really luxury, or is it really quality? Just quality is an interesting question to ask. At the same time, the early 90s saw another big move, and that was the move of manufacturing to Asia, into the chase for what became called the China price, which Walmart and I think Time magazine brought to the fore, that if you couldn't match the China price, you wouldn't be able to do business with Walmart. And that created, in a sphere very relevant to us, a segment called fast fashion. And it meant that as we moved into the 21st century, and you look at segment after segment of the leather industry, 3 things were really clear. There was no sector in which leather is a necessity. In every single sector that we sell leather now, the maker or the consumer has a choice of alternate materials. We may not think they're very good, they may think they're better, but the consumer has choices. Even in things like saddlery that we felt would always be leather, there are lots of synthetic saddles around right now. In every sector, the consumer has a choice. And I was in Ethiopia last week, and on the Thursday I attended the 7th All African Leather Fair. And in one of the stands I noticed a sign that said, "There is nothing like leather." And there was a slogan like that, or very similar to that, used by an American sole leather and belt leather company in 1924. And they produced big booklets using, "There is nothing like leather, nothing can replace leather." And an article appeared in 1929 written by a man called Swanson, which those of you at the university here can look up through the library resources, in which Mr. Swanson said, "That's a really fine slogan, but it's also stupid, because the reality is that there's nothing like leather as long as it's no more than 16 cents a pound, because they sold leather, as the people in this room will know, by weight. And above 16 cents a pound, the sole leather industry was being replaced by alternates. And a new word came in, which was value. What is the value of a piece of leather? The second thing that we saw as we moved into the 21st century was this huge polarization between everything that we buy and put leather into seems either to fit into what has been very loosely called luxury and into fast fashion. Luxury splits down. You'll see absolute luxury and accessible luxury, and the cheaper price goods fall into that new lower category. And if you look at some of the luxury reports by companies like Bain, they even have a third category, but it's not worth going into that sort of detail here. Fast fashion, of course, is very cheap items. Fast fashion, certainly for the leather industry, gives us difficulties. It means commodity pricing. So it means we don't make a profit. We maybe survive, but we probably don't. It means we're putting leather into sectors where longevity and many of its good attributes are not demonstrated. And it sends out confusing messages to the consumer. So against that sort of background, a couple of other things happened in the early part of the 21st century, which are still playing out now, which are really important to consider. And Ron did discuss in the previous webinar with a slightly different argument. The first is that in raw material supply, about 2005, the industry began to accept that there was a change in the amount of raw material growth that we can see going forward. That there is only so much room for the animals that provide us with our hides and skins on a small planet with our current population. And that in places like China and in Brazil, we're running out of grassland, and that if we do choose to go to more industrial intensive farming, the cost of putting that in certain places in terms of water, in terms of energy, in terms of waste management, in terms of the sheer cost of converting with large amounts of fertilizer, with large CO2 outputs into protein to food, that cost is very high. That's playing out right now because China just in the last week have changed the regulations on importing grain, and the supposition of that is that China wants to allow its people to start accelerating its consumption of meat more towards the very high American levels, which I think was a surprise to us all, but it's a situation that is ongoing at the moment. But what is clear is that whereas in the 20th century, if you go back and do your numbers, you will see in the 20th century that the population of cattle worldwide kept pace with the growth of the population of the human population in the world, and that ratio is now beginning to separate, and we are not going to have as much per capita leather in the world available to the growing population going forward. So there's a big group of people being saying, this luxury goods business driven by consumerism in China is really growing. The raw materials getting more scarce, the raw materials getting more valuable. Marketing is a complete waste of time in that scenario. All it's going to do is harm. Give up marketing, make a good product, sell it to the luxury goods trades, and we're going to be rich forever because we've got a scarce material to play with. But of course there was another side to that scenario that we have to consider, is that one of the big changes that everyone in the industry has noted in the last 20 years is that the quality of raw material has been declining. Even, and we heard this at the discussion dinner supported by National Beef and run by Leather International in Bologna last autumn, which kind of is the precursor of these webinars and the debates we're going to have in APLF Hong Kong, is that even in the best areas like the United States, where we're used to getting very high quality hides and skins, we are seeing a deterioration. And I just mentioned I'd been in Ethiopia, and the prime quality skins of Ethiopia are their sheepskin. And since I began buying them in the 1980s and looking at them now, the quality has just turned on its head. From 60, 70, 80% first to thirds, we're down at 10 to 20% first to thirds because of changes in animal husbandry and other issues. And of course, if you're only working in the luxury goods trades, the luxury goods trades struggle, absolutely struggle, to take middle and lower quality grades. And so you have a problem if you're trying to say we've got a scarce resource and it can all go to luxury goods, and the luxury goods trade saying, yes, we want your leather, but only if it's grades A and grades B, and we don't want any of the middle and the lower grades, do something else. And we leave ourselves only with the fast fashion, commodity, low-priced sector to sell our leather into. And that fast fashion, low-price, cheap sector, I would say is absolute evidence of the failure of marketing inside the leather industry. If you think it through, the type of products that go in there are terribly product oriented. We're making an assumption that if ever you see a scratch, you cover it in a plastic coating and you stick a print on it, and you make it look worse than some of the plastic competitors which are now coming up. That's pretty careless positioning in terms of marketing. Then you're selling it at a commodity price, which is not going to earn you a profit. At best, it's going to help cover some of your overhead. So you're playing with marginal costings. And those of you who've been in the industry a long time know that a couple of years of marginal costings really means you're about to close down. You're not going to survive on that mechanism. And particularly when you start to look at some parts of the third world where we've got issues on environmental and health and safety and life safety at work, wearing proper workwear, handling chemicals properly, handling effluent properly. If these people are forced into selling leather into the commodity sector at very low prices, even although there are big issues about dysfunctional governments, as in Bangladesh, and other difficulties with greedy owners that won't invest in effluent plants. If you're not bringing in the margins, we're never going to get that weekend of the leather industry pulled up, and we're never going to get rid of all these areas that those that don't like leather can leverage against the rest of the leather industry, which is a clean, good, sustainable, renewable industry of which we should be rightly proud, and we want to spend our time promoting. So I'm very against the fast fashion sector. And I remember when I first met Andres Colomer, the famous Colomer group from Barcelona. It was in a bus. It was in a bus in Argentina in an ICT meeting 30 or 40 years ago. We were touring tanneries, and we were talking about the low-end problem in tanneries, and he said, well, really it's only a matter of price. And I think today, were he alive, he would say, no, it's not a matter of price. It's a matter of technology and product development and good marketing, and starting to think about what the consumer really is expecting of leather and of leather products. And let me just take you into another area of coffee. There's a utility price for coffee, which is pretty low, say $1 a cup. But if you've just arrived at the station, you're rushing to work, and you're in desperate need of a coffee to get yourself awake in the morning, and there's a convenient coffee shop there that will sell you one that you can rush off to work, maybe you'll pay $2, twice the utility price, because it's a solution to your product in a context-specific situation. Then later in the day, you want to have a meeting with someone off-site. So you'll maybe go to a coffee shop. Dare I mention Starbucks in England, rather dislike because they don't pay taxes, but they provide a coffee that's a bit more than $2. I don't know what it is. I don't go there. Maybe they pay $4 or $5 for that coffee. But that multiple of the utility is not for the coffee. It's for the experiences built around the coffee, which include having a place to work, having free Wi-Fi, having comfortable chairs, being able to hold little meetings with business people or with friends. It's your physical Facebook, your networking site, going back to where we used to be 200 years ago, and the price is worth more. Now you're beginning to say, we're not selling here the product of coffee. We're selling a solution. And if we start to think about our customers in terms of what's the solution that we are providing them with, rather than saying, here's a rawhide, how do we make a nice product? Then we're going to start thinking about the types of product that we ought to develop, that customers will really value and will solve their problems. A different way of thinking than just saying, I will make a product. And of course, when leather was a necessity, just making a product and having in our own mind as tanners what's a good product and what's a not so good product, without thinking about the final consumer's understanding of that product, that was easy because you could always sell it. It was a necessity. But if it's not a necessity, if it's a product bought by choice, you have to start thinking through the consumer's mind. You have to become much more consumer oriented, and that's the transition that the leather industry is going through right now. So we look at those lower grades and we start thinking, how can I use them without just turning them into plastic and selling them at the lowest price that I can get for them, or the highest price, but in a very low category. How can I add some value to that? So for example, if you're using a shoe or an article that's going to have a membrane in it to keep it waterproof, the number of seams in it becomes less important, because the fact that the seams may leak is less relevant if you've got a membrane. So you can use smaller components in a shoe or another article, and you can cut around more defects. In some instances, a discussion with the consumer properly formed allows the consumer to consider that a healed scar, certain healed defects, are part of the natural nature of leather, and they're not expecting their leather to be absolutely smooth and perfect like a piece of plastic. And it's looking at, are you putting each category of leather into the right end use? Are you being as creative in your thinking on how that leather can be made? And there are many examples as you look round of how what we would have considered automatically as product-oriented tanners, as low-grade material, can go into high-grade categories. And I know at this university, everyone is really delighted with the strong relationship we have with the Echo shoe company. And their Yak footwear is a really fine example of just what I'm talking about. There are others around the world, but if you want to look at one, just look at Yak. And the consumer buys with delight and with evident satisfaction a product that's heavily scarred, heavily damaged, and every other tanner in the world making things out of Yak covers that with large layers of plastic. So you're not really buying leather at all, you're buying leather as a substrate which is really carrying plastic to the consumer, and the consumer can't tell what they're actually buying. And that's a whole mindset that we have to start changing. And of course, if you do that and you are providing consumers with a solution, your pricing is not the utility price of the $1 coffee. Your pricing is your value to the consumer in that context. Most of us tend to think in basic terms about purchasing being a really rational, carefully thought out thing. I have a need. I will examine the options. I will consider the price and then come to a conclusion. That's only about 20% of the purchases we make. Somewhere around 40% are either impulse or totally emotional, and the other 40 are habitual. And so just saying that everything is irrational is absolutely nonsensical. We're not rational beings. Think about yourself and your own purchases. You don't go about those in a rational way. Most of your purchases are habitual or emotional, and they're all context specific. They all vary depending on where you are at any one time, and that defines the value to you, what solution you're getting, and what the value you can get from it. And there you come to luxury goods. Luxury goods have no value in the long term if you're saying that a t-shirt made in the same factory with a simple stitching, two-piece, and somebody sticks a fancy brand name on it to sell it at $50 and somebody else sells it in a Walmart at $5. That has been what's happening over the last 15 years. Maybe not quite so extreme, but we've been buying the brand name. I grew up on the days when the brand name you kept inside your clothes, not on the outside of your clothes. That's changed now. But deep down, we are interested in value. And the idea that there is a category where we will buy a cheap item that doesn't have integrity and quality built into that item just because it's got a brand name on it, that is going to come to an end. And I would also say to those who believe that the Chinese consumer is going to carry on buying luxury ad infinitum are also entirely wrong. Those of you listening out there who were at Philp will remember when at the Philp meeting last year I forewarned, and it was public knowledge, nothing specific, everybody knew it, that there was going to be a clampdown in China on the purchase of luxury goods by public officials because they were worried about corruption. But we also discussed at the Leather International Conference in Shanghai about other trends going on with the Chinese consumer. And they're not about necessarily conspicuous consumption. They're not about ostentation. They do buy large quantities of what we call luxury goods, although that's moving very much from what you would call the having to the being, from buying products into buying experience, nice hotel experience, luxury spas material, and leather fits into that. If you're in leather development, think about leather as an experiential item. Its touch, its feel, its smell, its look. Those are increasingly important with consumers now, as is the craftsmanship that's going into the article which is made from it. And I'm so delighted that we've got in the room here in Northampton today the designer Bill Amberg, who will be out with us in Hong Kong at the Leather Forum. And he, more than anyone, expresses what can be achieved if you put craftsmanship into well-made leather that creates real, honest solutions for consumers. And I love in France what some of the luxury leather goods companies are doing in buying up small shoemakers and small glove makers in order to keep traditional crafts alive. In this great move to chase cheap labour in order to get affordable goods, an understandable program to work on, because of the rapid movement of people, we quite often have chosen only to train staff in basic methods of manufacture. So for example, in gloving, we have a stitch called the piqué stitch, famous in Yeovil, the English piqué stitch. It gives you a stretch in the seam which you can't get with a flat bed. Because it's a finger up into the glove, you can repair a glove without dismantling it. You can give a glove longevity, and it's a beautiful stitch. But because the workers in some Asian countries only stay for 6 or 9 months before moving on, there's been an unwillingness to train them in that stitch. And we're in danger of losing it. And we need to keep those skills because they work with leather to give the product longevity, to give the product repairability, to give it all of the things which make a consumer treasure it as an artifact just as much as a utility to carry their mobile phone or their perfume or to wear on their feet or to sit on in their cars. And it is with that sort of thinking I anticipate. I can see the industry going forward. I can see the luxury goods, the absolute luxury in France doing very well and working very well. And I'm really delighted to hear that they are beginning to take market share back from India and China through pure quality, authenticity and marvellous manufacture. But when we look at the 20 billion square feet of leather made through the world, we're not all going to be luxury. We're going to be quality. We're going to be that Coach bag of the 1980s that the ordinary American consumer bought because it smelt good, it looked good, it felt good, it got better over time, it lasted forever, and if anything went wrong with the stitching, they guaranteed free of charge repair. You really knew you were buying something of value, and you were willing to pay that bit more for it. And I've got a message here from Ralph that says the strength of the Italian leather industry is this ability to turn low-grade materials into high-grade leather at marketable price, serving both the luxury and the non-luxury markets. And you have to say that's absolutely true. And I had the fortune in the 1970s to end up working in a little tannery in Santa Croce, and we've got one or two Italian people in the room here. One is from Santa Croce, and that was my experience. Italy imports 80% of its raw material. I was sent by them to Pakistan. I was sent by them to Latin America. And what I was doing for the Santa Croce people was upgrading really low-grade material, but putting them in to finished leather, some of which I've still got at home, that I've kept because they were so beautiful. But it wasn't top French calf. It wasn't prime Swiss hides. This was cheap, low-grade raw material being upgraded for really beautiful footwear and bags made in, at that time, mostly made in Italy. Now I've got a comment also here that says you can have quality without luxury, but you can't have luxury without quality. And is that a solution you think the general consumer can identify and be satisfied? And I think actually it's what I've been saying, is that if you're a luxury brand that is trying to get by just by sticking your logo on a cheap article that's not well made, wherever it's made, then you'll fail. But if you are just making quality and you're selling quality, then the consumer will remember your brand name and will buy you for quality. And that is a better statement for a consumer who wants to be quietly self-confident than saying, oh, I've got to have just a luxury brand hanging around me in order to demonstrate that I'm a rich or a wise or a well-educated person. The choices you make will define you as a human being, and just going for quality without, just going for quality is the solution. Just going for luxury is not going to be a satisfactory, satisfying way of living if as you go forward. I don't see any more questions coming up, but I do think when you're making leather and you're looking at, I've just talked about luxury, but remember, luxury covers almost every category. It does cover footwear, it does cover automobiles, and it does cover bags and garments. The footwear is one of the most interesting in the current scenario, because footwear used to take up about 3/4 of all the leather that we made, certainly around the 1950s. It's varied hugely over history as different end uses have changed. And in the 1960s, we had the introduction of a product called Corfam that was going to change the footwear industry because they saw demand growing. And Corfam failed because demand didn't outgrow supply. There were two reasons Corfam failed. One, that it was a poor material and it wasn't good and comfortable for shoes, and it didn't provide a solution for wearable footwear. The second was that trainers were invented and textiles and some plastics went into that sector, and they did provide a good solution to certain products at a price. And I think that is fairly typical. You begin to look at the trainer market, and they are looking at creating materials that run for sprint distances, middle distances, mountain running, for casual wear, for town wear, and they adjust the materials and the price to deal with the solutions that the consumer is looking for. And we have to find out where leather fits. And we've got to develop leathers that fit into those categories where we see that we can offer value to the consumer. And I've had a question, I think from the room here, what developments in tanning have occurred recently that may open up new materials for a broader market? And it's a really interesting time right now, because if you look with people like Bill, who's asked this question, Bill Amberg, he's been putting leather back into sectors which have quite surprised us, onto types of leather goods where leather carefully crafted onto the leather goods humanizes modern life for us, with all these gadgets that we are that we use. Leather brings us back to feeling good about ourselves. It brings us back to humanizing the world in which we live, and we're seeing some big changes. There was initially a panic in the 90s from the car industry with some end-of-life issues arising on recycling, and they wanted everything to do with chromium taken out of cars. And that was a real spark to what had already begun for a search for what can replace chrome tanning. And there are a couple of points you have to make there. Is if you're looking environmentally at tanning, chromium tanning properly done, and the leather at the end of life properly disposed of, and that needs more thought, chrome tanning is a pretty good tanning. And we've spent 25 years searching for something which is better, and I don't think we've really found it. We've found alternates, some of which are very good. We were talking just before the start of this webinar about the way that titanium tanning has been overlooked, particularly its recent advances. And I think there, I've seen this done in Valencia. The product is fantastic, and it does allow you to think about using leather in different ways and in different scenarios. It's a fantastic hypoallergenic material. It allows you to develop different colors because it doesn't come from that strong green-blue substrate. And I think we're looking at quite a number of synthetic tannages which are coming up. And of course the vegetable tanning and traditional vegetable tanning is being re-examined, and that makes some absolutely fantastic products. And I'm a fan of the dongola tannage from the 1880s. And most of you here won't have heard of dongola, but you should go away and research it. It was developed to be a cheaper form of glacis kid for gloving. And it didn't do that at all. But it did actually make Gloversville in New York one of the richest tanning cities in the world for 10 years because it was great for footwear leather. And it was used in the UK for footwear leather until really about 1935, before chromium took over altogether. It was a mix of veg tan and aluminium, and it gave an exceptional leather. And I think there's a lot more research going on around different mixtures with some of the new synthetics and some of the of the more advanced veg tans. And I think there's a lot of way a lot of ways we can look forward to seeing advances coming. You're in a typical cycle of looking at lots and lots of new technology before we end up on one strong technology. It's kind of like the period when we were in 1880s, when we were looking at the bicycle. There were thousands and thousands of designs of bicycle going on at that time, really funny shapes, huge front wheels, tiny back wheels, vice versa, going on. And then they came to the standard frame, that triangular frame with roughly the same size wheel on front and back. And then they took from some other industry the inner tube concept to make the tires more comfortable. And for 100 years, that was the standard bicycle. But it had maybe 50 or 60 quite strong iterations before we got to that standard model. And that looks like what we're seeing going on right now in the leather industry. Now I've got a couple of questions which are slipping down the sheet here. One was talking about luxury brands taking rubbish leather and making great items from them. And I think that's possible, as long as it's done correctly and properly, so that the consumer is not being cheated. And I'm not sure I always believe in rubbish leather. What is rubbish leather? If leather's badly made, so it's got a poor tear strength and it's not fit for purpose, perhaps that's rubbish leather. If it's got a scar, it's might be like a weed, and what's a weed is a beautiful flower in the wrong place. Our job as technicians is to move it over, and that's what I loved about Santa Croce. They had, certainly in the 70s and 60s, 70s and 80s, they had the vision, and I think they're still doing it now, to take what others would call a rubbish piece of leather because of inherent defects and turn it into something beautiful that a luxury brand could use. I've had a question about the luxury brands buying tanneries, and it's an interesting one from Kelvin. Do you think mega fashion houses are buying up leather companies and tanneries? Do you think the trend will continue, thus increasing leather prices over time? Well, I'm not sure that will necessarily increase leather prices over time. I think the leather prices are going up because leather is becoming more scarce. I think there are some other things going on in the marketplace when you think of the asymmetry between the big meat packers in the world and the small tanners that are buying from them. So I think there's some false things in the current prices, but the underlying increase in raw material prices, I think, remains inevitable, and we're going to have to work harder on it, and I wouldn't blame it on the fashion houses. I think, as Ron Sawyer said, that buying up tanneries in the belief that you get access to raw material and security is perhaps a bit of a false route, but I'm not wholly convinced that's altogether what's going on here. I think some of it is about getting access to skills, and I think, like in the veg tanning area, I think some of our veg tanners who have survived are terribly traditional, and we're at a moment where some of the luxury houses that use them would like them just to move their technology, nudge it a little bit forward. We've got a couple of really fabulous veg tanning companies here in the United Kingdom that I'm certainly aware of are really doing some advanced things. So they're playing with tradition, they're playing with the history of leather, but they're putting it in a contemporary setting, and they're making exquisite items that really, really give us a chance to start putting leather right into the consumer hands and really make something fantastic. And I think some of what the big brands that have been buying into tanneries have been doing is making sure that they hang on to technology in a way they can move it forward. I think also there's a very big issue in terms of authenticity and in traceability going on right now in a difficult world that we live in. And you're going to see more vertical integration going on. And I also believe that vertical integration allows companies to make better use of the leather. I think this concept that we will roll up our leather in this room and send it by lorry to another room, and somebody will then open it again and re-examine and carry out the work we did here in checking it, but from a different point of view. That just seems entirely wrong. Sending back bits that aren't quite right. The tanner and the leather goods maker or shoemaker or garment maker have to work much more closely together, and sometimes that means co-ownership to make it happen. Florian's talking about using renewable ingredients. Can leather making become again sustainable? Well, I think leather making is sustainable. The bit I don't like about leather making is that we put leather that contains chromium into landfill, and I think we have to stop that. And I think we have to work with designers to consider the end of life, and that the leather be reused, or that the chromium be extracted before it goes into landfill. I fully accept that there's only about 3% of all the chromium used in the world goes into leather, and it's a very specific type. And I also accept that leather in landfill is harmless, and there's no chance of it converting to chrome 6, and we must challenge those who argue that it can. But I don't like the concept. I think in terms of circular economy, we should be thinking about what's going to happen to goods at end of life, and I'm glad that the university here is at least in discussions about what's going on. I think we need to argue very strongly that leather is truly sustainable, but my main comment there is to do it based on very good science, and that it's not right just to say, veg tan is organic because vegetable material comes from organic sources. We use lots of inorganic chemicals in the manufacture of vegetable tanning. We use very, very high volumes of vegetable tanning in making veg tanned leather. So while veg tan is fabulous and to be hugely encouraged, and I think everything I've brought here today is veg tanned. I love the material, but we've got to be careful. Are we using sustainable sources of veg tans, and are we properly equipped to handle the big volumes of oxygen demand that comes from the effluent that it produces, and that we don't just call it organic and assume that it's going to be biologically degradable, because we know jolly well that it is not under any definition biologically degradable. It needs an accelerant in order to degrade under any definition. And I've got a question also from the front row here in Northampton. The general perception may be that leather is a luxury purchase, but in your opinion, how well equipped is the general consumer to judge? That is a very interesting question. If you think about the Chinese consumer in particular, that's kind of the new consumer. 400 million middle-class Chinese, 150 million Indian Chinese are now middle class. We're going up to billions by 2020. The growth of the middle classes is absolutely enormous. They're mostly young, they're mostly urban, they don't get to see a cow till they're about 15. The evidence is they haven't got a clue that leather comes from cows. They don't have any of the understanding that we as tanners have, that leather is a natural material and a renewable treatment material. There is just one absolutely enormous job to be done to educate the consumer. What is interesting is the modern consumer, young consumer, is interested. And through social media and other tools and coffee shops, we have the routes to do that education and to get people engaged and interested. So I think it's a real tough battle but it's one that is going to be fun to engage in. The whole industry is, I think, coming together to engage in it. All the disparate organisations are beginning to think alike now, and I think everyone is getting serious. But it's a marketing issue. It's about not thinking about marketing in terms of, we have a product, please have a nice advertising campaign and persuade people to buy it. That's history. The modern consumer doesn't accept being dictated to in that way. Marketing is a conversation. Marketing begins deep inside the product, and it's about positioning, and it's about value, and it's about accessibility, and it's about solutions to their problems. And I think on that, I've run out of questions, and I've run out of time. So I will say cheerio to everybody, and see you, if possible, in the Hong Kong Fair in 4 weeks' time. Thank you. No. We seem to be offline. Thank you very much. Thanks for being patient.